All right, joining me now in our New Voices series is Micah Erfan. Micah is a law student currently at the University of Virginia. He's a graduate of the University of Houston. But he's done a lot more than that. He's already been a pretty active member of the Texas Democratic Party Executive Committee. He's now becoming a part of Adam Mockler's world. For those of you that have been following my New Voices series, we had Adam on a few months ago. So, Michael, welcome. Nice to meet you.
So glad to be here.
Tell me more. You also, I know, have a publication. Tell me everything you're working on that isn't law school, and then I'll try to figure out how the heck you're going to do law school in all of this.
Yeah, right. So whatever I should be studying, but I'm actually doing something else. I'm contributing to this media company that me and some other creators founded. It's called the Siren. We thought that online there's just a huge imbalance with the number of right-wing accounts. Media Matters has done a lot of research on this, shown a huge impressions gap, follower gap across social media platforms. We wanted to have a media company that elevated creators that don't really have very much of a platform, try to help them create some sort of infrastructure so they could get started creating content. So that company is called the Siren. And of course I'm contributing to Adam's channel. I'm doing policy research for Adam. So whenever Adam Mockler, which is, I think,
he's got
one of the best voices in our party, whenever he goes out to debate right wingers, me and him for like 3 hours before those public appearances are going through all the data. So he's prepared to deliver the best talking points.
What is your policy like? You know, when you get to read what's the policy you feel like you know the best and have gone deepest on because you're so passionate about it?
I would say 100% housing. That's actually how I got started in advocacy. I've always been interested in politics, but the first like real in-person political activity that I've ever done that really mattered was in undergrad. I looked at the city of Houston because that's where I grew up, and I was like, man, this city is like really car-centric and kind of ugly. You know, I've been on many trips around the world.
Just terribly laid out, right? All the flood. We learned this over Hurricane Harvey, right? Was it Harvey, the one that just deluged? And you're like, who the hell developed housing on a floodplain? You know?
Exactly. And it's all freeways, and there's like these huge parking lots. And you look at the old pictures of the city of Houston, and you have these beautiful streetcars and like dense downtown. Now, 25% of downtown Houston is surface level parking, not even parking garages. And so I wondered, like, why did that happen? You know, I used to travel a lot as a kid because my dad does missionary work. And so I'd go to places like Sweden and Turkey, and I'd say, wow, these places look really nice. What's the difference? And I noticed that there was a lot of local regulations on how we develop that were in place that were.
I thought there were no regulations in Houston. That was part of the problem.
So that's what people think. We have no zoning. That's like on paper, but we actually have private zoning for 25% of the city. We have private deeds that allow neighborhoods to create their own restrictive covenants, and the city funds enforcement for those covenants. And some of them have like straight up racist clauses within the deeds. They were founded like 100 years ago to keep out low income housing in their neighborhood. So we have that kind of private zoning, but we also have a lot of regulations. For instance, at bars, you have to have like 3 or 4 parking spots for every seat in the bar. It's really peculiar. So,
and nobody has an idea. Like, did you ever find out what was there had to be a reason in the time that it was written why they wanted that? Was it a land grab?
Really funny. So they're trying to find a way to penalize bars because they wanted less of them. And so they thought if you just required them to build huge parking lots, that will like reduce the amount of people who drink. In reality, it just means you have these crazy, stupid parking lots, which are all around.
Well, is that why patio bars are becoming more popular in Texas in general? That they just turn these old parking lots into big patios?
That could be the explanation. What I started doing is going to our local planning commission and like just bringing people to talk about specific elements of the code, which is like the nerdiest thing ever. It was shock to everybody there. They were like, why is like some people from college here? But actually we have eventually changed 4 local laws to make it where more affordable types of housing and walkable developments were legal. And that's kind of how I got my bug. And I've been doing housing advocacy ever since.
Well, look, you sort of really scratched an itch just there with me when it comes to housing, because, you know, during the 2024 campaign season, one of the things, whenever I run into members of Congress, you know, I'll say, hey, what's an issue we're not covering enough that you're hearing from your constituents all the time about? And it didn't matter if I was talking to a D or an R, they'd all say, oh, affordable housing. It's funny. It's like all these congressional town halls, the national media may be going, are you getting Epstein questions? Are you getting Trump questions? And really, like, those that are like concerned, there's this undergirding issue, which is housing. And what's been fascinating, what's been frustrating, I think, for housing advocates, and I'm guessing like yourself, is how little the national parties know how to deal with this issue. The Harris campaign, I think people went to the Harris campaign trying to get her on this. And the problem is it isn't easy to connect the dots to people on a national level, right? And yet it's an issue that seems to be percolating all over the country, regardless if you live in a big city, or if it can be an affordable housing issue. It could be, frankly, just environmentally safe housing issue. Like we got that problem in Miami, where we get the daytime flooding and things like that. So you're picking a good issue to be an expert on at a time when I think a lot of Americans care about this issue.
I think young people don't have a choice.
Yeah.
Like I look at housing prices and I'm like, how am I ever going to do this? Thank God I'm in law school, because lawyers tend to have better prospects. But a lot of my fellow students, we want to go into public service. Like we want to help contribute to solving a lot of these problems. And on public service salaries, when you factor in student debt, you start looking at this financial equation where being able to own a home is way off in the distance, and every single year it gets even further because prices go up. Rents are extraordinary, and as you mentioned, there's also the issue of poorly maintained housing, because a huge percentage of the rental housing stock in this country is poorly maintained. In a state like Texas, you could basically not get basic livability rules like having no mold in your unit enforced, because there is no government enforcement. So the poor tenants have to sue themselves against the huge landlords that have been locked into these really prejudicial agreements. So it's a huge mess, and there's a tremendous opportunity for progress.
Do you see this? This is a legacy issue with Texas, that there's still this like mindset it's the Wild West, and just sort of you just make your own rules, because it's funny you said that there's these independent communities with the covenants. Then there's this independent school districts business where you can literally pop up your own independent school district pretty easily. And suddenly you have a school board out of nowhere that shows up, and a new curriculum or whatever. This seems to be a common issue on a lot of, I don't even know what to call it. It's not regulatory things, but in sort of what would in any other state maybe be handled by city or state. There's this sort of nebulous area of how Texas is unregulated.
I think Texas has an enormous corruption issue, and I'm going to cite a few examples for you.
Okay.
One of the things I worked on whenever I worked in the state Senate in Texas was this issue of benzene emissions. This is one of the toxic substances that is emitted in Houston. Houston's an area that we struggle a lot with air quality.
Always has been an issue.
The Texas Commission on Air Quality had observed in a certain neighborhood, Channelview, Texas, that benzene emissions had been above their healthy level, above the maximum level that TCEQ had set for over 20 years. And repeatedly, every time they'd observe that it was above the regulatorily established level, they'd actually raise the standard. They'd raise the level to make it easier for the local plants owned by KSOL to meet the requirement. And still, they exceeded it every single time. Did KSOL or any of these other industrial refineries ever get fined? No. Zero regulatory enforcement. That's what happens whenever you fill all the regulatory offices with leadership from lobbying groups, right? You put the petrochemical folks in charge of regulating petrochemicals. You get this terrible situation where people in Channelview have I think a cancer occurrence rate 4 times the national average, twice the Houston average.
Where are the trial lawyers? Why aren't they suing?
So there's no cause of action, So the people in the neighborhood, they can't sue to enforce these climate regulations, because the way the government's structured these laws, only the state and federal agencies can enforce these regulations, which I also think was a terrible choice. But of course, lobbyists fought for that as well, because they knew that if only the government could enforce these regulations, all they needed to do was capture the government and they would be safe. And the most remarkable thing, Chuck, is talking to the state senators and the politicians, I asked them, why can't we just pass a bill that tells them they have to enforce their own rules? And they said that would never even get past committee, because that's how bought and paid for the state of Texas is. I could list you examples all day, but it's being inside the beast. You kind of see how really terrible it is.
What you're describing is what happens to any state that has had one party rule for too long. And it's it's something I've observed. It doesn't matter which party. If one party's in charge for more than a decade, they just get cozy with industry, because industry is only going to deal with the party in charge, right? It's almost inevitable. And you see this, and unfortunately it takes people dying for voters to care, to not fully, and then suddenly, but unfortunately it's after the impact, right? We don't, that's
and if it's in marginalized communities, it ends up never.
So Winston
mattering.
Churchill said that's also true. But that's what Churchill said about us, right? The Americans will do the right thing when they've exhausted every other avenue of doing the wrong thing.
The iconic quote.
What's your observation about why the Democratic Party is so weak in Texas? And because you look at the population, and it's a diverse population. It's frankly, on most issues, it might be slightly more to the right on some issues, but not. This isn't Idaho, okay?
Right.
But structurally, right, the party's been out of power for so long, it almost feels like they've stopped competing. Like, I don't see candidates for Railroad Commission. I don't see candidates for some of the down. The only way you can start getting some political power back is to run.
Right. I have a lot to say about that, because, of course, I was in the leadership committee of the party, so I was like in the belly of the beast.
I figured you would.
I would say, in large part, though, it's a symptom of a larger issue, which is the brand of the Democratic Party, which is something that's nationally determined, and Texas Democrats can only really deal with what they're dealt, the cards they're dealt.
I can tell you this: when I was growing up, Ann Richards was the brand of the Texas Democratic Party, and that was a positive brand. Ann Richards was a positive brand. Lloyd Benson. There was a time where Texas Democrats actually could distinguish themselves from the national brand.
Right. And I think ideally the independent strategy for Texas should be to be more like North Carolina, where the Democrats kind of can get some Republican voters who say, yeah, I don't really like the normal Democrats, but the Texas Democrats are fine. Right. I think that we've had an infrastructure issue. The Texas Democratic Party doesn't have very much money. There's a lot of divisions because people don't have a central organization they can kind of trust. And this is the real weeds of how politics ends up working behind the scenes. But a lot of politicians don't like maybe the person who's running the party. So they want to support nonprofits. This last election cycle, we barely had a coordinated campaign. So each campaign was doing their own thing rather than pooling their resources and making sure, for instance, whenever there's a door knock, all of the campaigns make sure they hit all of the doors instead of all hitting the same doors 8 times.
You're getting at something, and I've observed in a lot of states where a candidate, a major party candidate doesn't trust or like the state party chair. Their biggest donor, who might be running, who might have been able to help the state party, instead funds a super PAC that only supports that one race.
Right. I think the biggest issue for Texas Democrats, though, is the Hispanic vote. We were getting kind of close to being competitive, and then we saw this huge shift with Hispanics. I talked to a lot of Hispanics, I feel like I was surrounded by Hispanics in Houston, and a lot of these folks had no idea what the Democrats were fighting for at all. And they knew one thing about Trump. They knew that he was going to close the border and get rid of the people who shouldn't be there. And a lot of Hispanics don't like undocumented immigrants because they perceive them as making them look bad. They perceive them as kind of cutting and cheating the rules. The funniest thing about that, though, is many of these Hispanics, anecdotally, I know, actually were asylum seekers, or they overstayed their visa but ended up getting some sort of legal status after the fact. It is still remarkable that the people that fall in that category still have perhaps the most animus towards the more recent undocumented immigrants.
Why do you think the Democrats didn't fully? Because I've heard this too, that Democrats basically don't realize that fighting for immigration is a net negative with Latinos. It's not a net positive.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, because like they
focus
don't.
Group would have told you this.
Like
you
they
know?
don't think of the Republicans as being anti them specifically. They just think of them being anti like all of the Hispanics that are annoying and loud and like blare their music or whatever. I think the reason why Democrats didn't connect with them is because, well, our messaging was like really bad, frankly. Like, what was Kamala's message and Biden's message protecting our democracy? I think a big lesson for me is that nobody really cares about our democracy. Like whenever people go home every night, they're not like, oh, I'm so thankful that we have our democracy. We need to keep this. They think things are expensive. There's like trash on the street. There's all these homeless people that are being annoying to
Right.
me. I don't feel safe in this neighborhood. These are the kind of like basic issues that they deal with. And they felt like Trump was going to do something about some stuff that they cared about. And the Democrats not only didn't have any sort of policies that they could identify with, but also they had overseen tons of inflation, which they were very upset about.
There's a reason results matter more than promises. Just like there's a reason Morgan & Morgan has become America's largest injury law firm. For the last 35 years, they've recovered $25 billion for more than 500,000 clients. It includes cases where insurance companies offered next to nothing, short of shortchanging, seeing if they could get away with it. And Morgan & Morgan fought back, and they won millions. In Pennsylvania, one client was awarded $26 million. It was a staggering 40 times the amount that the insurance company originally offered. That offer, $650,000, whatever it took to sort of get away without paying. So with more than 1,000 lawyers across the country, Morgan & Morgan knows how to deliver for everyday people. So if you're injured, you're looking for a lawyer, check out forthepeople.com/Toddcast or dial pound law, pound 529 on your cell phone. And remember, all law firms are not the same. So give Morgan & Morgan a look. Their fee is free unless they win. Well, I've had a lot of Democratic strategists said they lost the argument internally when they said, look, Hispanic voters are no different than any working class voting group. They don't have the luxury to worry about the democracy. I always say, I have the luxury to worry about the democracy. I don't have a financial crisis right now. I don't have a personal health crisis. I can't sleep because of what's happening to the country, but it's a luxury, right? If I'm trying to get my, I got my kids in college, so but if I'm trying to make ends meet, I care about the democracy, but I got to make ends meet before I can do something about it. And I think that was the disconnect.
Right. I also think there's a reach issue, right? So you need to have a good message and you need to get it out to people. Mm-hmm. And I think the Democrats struggle with both of those elements. Mm-hmm. The right-wing media ecosystem is extremely sophisticated and extremely effective.
You said something interesting about the Siren and how, and I've actually tried to articulate this to people and they don't fully appreciate it. Now, granted, I'm articulating it as somebody who's my age, not your age, when I say, there's this perception that the media leans left. And I said, the entire information ecosystem actually leans right.
Absolutely.
How would you prove that data point wise? Because I would love to have more data to support. I know it. I see it. I see it in cable television ratings. I see it in what goes viral on YouTube and all these things. But there isn't one metric out here to make my case. How would you make that case?
Right. So more than half of voters say that they get at least some of their news from social media. That's almost certainly an underrepresentation because people don't want to admit that they're getting their news from Twitter. I remember I was in a class where my teacher said, where do you get your news? And there was people saying that they read the newspaper. Absolutely not true. No one in my generation is doing that. Yeah. They're getting it from Twitter. They're getting it from Instagram. And there's been studies that have looked at the biggest accounts on those biggest political accounts on those various social media sites. And overwhelmingly, almost every single time, it's right-wing accounts disproportionately. There's also studies that look at the impression gap. We know on YouTube, if you want to look at the top biggest political YouTube channels, there are people like Candace Owens, people like Tucker Carlson. These are folks that just dwarf like Democratic creators in terms of their
Do they just understand the algorithm better? What do you think it is?
They got a head start for sure. I mean, these guys started investing in social media back in 2015. They have all these organizations. This is one of the reasons why we founded the Siren. PragerU started having a creator program, right? And they started uplifting all these voices. A lot of the folks came from there. TPUSA, of course, the Daily Wire. I mean, think about how many of these huge independent right-wing content creators ended up coming from the Daily Wire. Even some of our the right wing creators that are out there got their start on the few progressive organizations that exist, like the Young Turks. They gave us Dave Rubin, and I believe they gave us another right wing creator. So very few creators just kind of come up independently. They have some sort of infrastructure that supports them. And right wingers understood that way before the Democrats did. I think the Democrats are only beginning to understand that the issue of the imbalance and only beginning to try to invest in a solution.
Are you at all concerned that we don't have one place where everybody can share their opinions, and that there's sort of an opportunity to see it without being? I feel like now, if you mostly lean one way, you only hear about the other side through the prism of disagreements, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. No, I think social media is like unambiguously terrible for our country, and the ability for us to have a democratic system, I think it's contributing to enormous amounts of radicalization. And if I could like snap my fingers tomorrow, as somebody who creates content and invests a lot of my time in that, I would end all political social media. I think it would be much better. But if this is the battleground, I think people that are on the left, people that care about democracy, have no choice but to win. And unfortunately, I don't see any way that we're going to get to us having a single conversation with an algorithm that leads us to like engage with all of the opinions that are nuanced.
No, I mean, I don't know what we do about this unless we somehow get rid of algorithms.
Right. You can look at Blue Sky, where it's like you see the posts from the people that you follow, but look at Blue Sky's numbers. It doesn't seem like that's winning
They're only
format
talking to
in the marketplace.
No, I mean, Blue Sky feels like just a left-wing alternative to Truth Social.
It really does. In many ways,
where there's you're not, I will say this. I feel like on Substack, you can curate a pretty bipartisan experience. More so than probably any other space.
Yeah, increasingly on places like YouTube and TikTok, they're so algorithmic that you can't even really curate your feed.
They won't let you. Yeah.
You see these huge YouTube channels that have tons of subscribers. They get very low engagement. Small channels get really high engagement.
What's the explanation for that?
So my understanding of how YouTube works is they look at your retention and your impression click-through rate. So how many people click on your video and how long did they stay? And that's like the biggest thing. And the past performance of your videos factors in, your subscriber count factors in, but they're not the biggest factors. It's just it's like very merit-based. The issue is it doesn't really allow people to have the agency to say, well, even if this other kind of content maybe would be more exciting to me, I want to explicitly like choose to have these maybe channels that are higher quality or expose me to some stuff that I wouldn't have watched otherwise. You don't really have that agency anymore. It's the same thing on TikTok, same thing on Instagram, pretty much all the social media platforms, except for, as you said, Substack, have this system now in place.
What's funny about it is that I don't know why the social media companies did this, because you're in law school now, but in some ways they've become, the minute they create algorithms like that and decide what goes up or down, they're publishers. How are they not publishers? And therefore no longer subject to the protection of Section 230.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, listen, I haven't taken a course on this yet, but to me, that would seem right. I mean, the more work that you do in sorting the content and getting it out to people, it would seem like the case that you're a publisher.
If I'm a newspaper publisher, I decide what was on the front page, what was on page A4, what would be, if I'm deciding what gets the number 1 slot versus the number 2 slot, which is what an algorithm is doing, and it's not like the user created the algorithm, it's the platform that created the algorithm.
Right. And there also is content moderation, which you could say you could kind of like that to editing to a certain extent, right? You edit op-eds, but you don't fully change them. You just say, we're not going to take this one and we're going to cut this out of here. So I think it's a good argument. I think it's good. I wonder what the courts will do then.
Tell me about going to the University of Houston. And the reason I ask, I was blown away when I went, my son's going to school in Texas too. He's at SMU. But we looked at Houston, we looked at Rice, we looked at UT. We liked, frankly, I loved Houston. Now, Houston was huge, right? It's a big campus. But I thought it was going to be this commuter school, and I was really impressed that it wasn't. And not only that, it feels like it's a state school about to take the next step. How would you describe it?
Well, we've certainly gone up in the rankings a lot. We built our sports teams. We got second place in basketball this last
No,
year.
that stuff matters.
My
That
dad's
gets
been
you a different,
super
right.
my dad's been super obnoxious about it because he's a UF grad. So that was a really bad day for me whenever we lost that game, but I'm recovering from it.
I didn't
It's been
realize you
great.
were related to a gator. It's, that's tough for a hurricane
It's
who's
awful.
married
It's
to a
awful.
Seminole. But anyway, go
Totally
ahead.
insufferable. I mean, I've seen the campus transform since I got there.
Yeah.
They're rebuilding buildings all the time. There's a lot of money coming in. It's really nice.
And that
because
neighborhood is getting better too, right?
Well, so the surrounding neighborhood is Third Ward, which is one of the poorest,
Right.
least invested in neighborhoods in the city of Houston. But I actually really liked that it was located there because it gives you a lot more interface with the community. For me, I biked to school a lot of the time. So I would go through and you'd see the streets, dumpsters that are overfilled, a lot of homes that are abandoned on campaigns. I'd canvass in that area. And you see that Houston is actually an incredibly segregated city.
Yeah.
The lines drawn on the map for congressional districts, for House districts, for city council districts are across racial lines. And it is extraordinary, the racial difference from neighborhood to neighborhood. You can point to one side of the road and say, that's a Hispanic neighborhood. And it's going to be overwhelmingly Hispanic. You might not see an African American. And on the other side, it might be all African Americans. You won't see a single white person. I find that really problematic. But we were nestled into a historic African American neighborhood.
What explain the whole, what is it? Is it loops in Houston? What is it? The rings or
Yeah. So we have the inner loop,
that's
the
what it is.
outer
Inner
loop.
Yeah.
There's like an outer loop.
And there's and each have their own culture.
We have the most, I think, concentric loops of like any city in the world. We're working on a fourth one right now. I mean, it's atrocious. Driving on the roads in Houston is so bad. I spent my entire life there and I still make the wrong turns sometimes. And it will take you forever to get back to where you need to go.
I have a friend who lives there and he was trying to explain, oh no, I have a friend your friend lives, you're going to be in the inner loop. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about?
Right.
And I guess that meant really downtown. Is that what it means?
Yeah. The inner loop is not actually downtown, but it's like all the area around downtown where it's like you're sort of actually close to the city. I mean, the joke about Houston is Houston's an hour away from Houston. The truth is it's really like an hour and 45 minutes away from Houston because, man, the city has like annexed like suburbs. So it's really gotten like tremendous.
No, it's like Mexico City. Mexico City did the same thing. As it expanded, it just added land.
Exactly.
And it's just this vast, monstrous geographic and populated city. So how'd you get political?
Yeah, so I always cared. I grew up with an extremely conservative family. And as I got older, of course, my ideology changed. I'm not super conservative. I still have my notes though from whenever I was like 12 years old, and I wrote like my description of Republican and Democrat. And under Democrat, I wrote communist, anti-gun, loves abortion. So we've certainly made a little bit of progress in terms of my political education.
So that's interesting. Why do you think you had that sort of stereotype of what a Democrat was? Because that's a pretty, that there are many Democrats that would be like, that's not how I would describe it.
Well, yeah, I wouldn't describe the Democrats. If the Democrats were described that way, I might be less supportive of them. But I got a lot of my news from my dad and my grandfather. My grandfather's a card-carrying member of the NRA. I grew up shooting guns. I grew up going to church 3 times a week. Of course,
when I was growing up, though, there were plenty of churchgoers who were from both sides of the aisle. And back in the 80s and 90s, the NRA was bipartisan.
Well, in my town, people wear a Confederate flag on their hat. And so like, there's kind of a clear dividing line. My dad was like sending a bunch of money to the GOP every single month. And I went to a private Christian school. So I was really surrounded in this Southern Christian culture where you don't say cuss words like "but." That's a cuss word in my family. You only listen to Christian music. And I remember one of my distinct first political memories was in my Christian school. It was 2012 on election day, and people were chanting in the lunchroom, "Romney, Romney, Romney." Clearly not many other people around the country were chanting that day because he didn't do so well. But like these were kids in middle school. So this is just an extraordinarily conservative group. Whenever I became more of a liberal in high school, I felt a lot of social ostracization. It was like one of the most taboo things you could do in the community I grew up in.
Do you get along with your family, I assume?
I do now. I
Good.
get along. They didn't like it when it first happened, but they've learned to accept it. And we practice bipartisan dialogue on a daily basis, me and my grandparents, and we find middle ground all the time.
Because I have some friends, some family friends whose kids and their parents are not getting along because their politics are so vast. And I mean, give some advice. How have you and your grandparents been able to, you know, not blow up your personal relationship over politics?
You know, I talk to my grandparents literally all the time. I talk to them
That's great.
at least 2 times a week, probably, because I love them more than anybody else in the world. And we always talk about politics because they're obsessed with it. And of course, that's a huge part of my life.
Yeah.
And whenever we
Well, it,
first talked about it, it
yeah.
was like a really stressful thing. And we were like, oh no, let's just not talk about this. And I kind of found a way to make these conversations better. And I think it starts with acknowledging and validating what they're saying
A
and
little
like how
empathy.
they feel.
Yeah.
Instead of just like trying to smack everything they say down, like that's not true, that's false. I could be like, I understand why you think that way, or why do you think that way? Ask questions, try to figure it out, and then you express your own opinion and you use I words. You don't just make declarative statements, and you can say, well, that's interesting. I didn't see that, but I saw this. And sometimes it's really helpful to introduce value statements where you could
Mm-hmm.
say, like, well, if that actually did happen, I really disagree with it, but I don't actually think that happened. And here's why. And they might not agree with you on it, but at least you know that there's some foundational values that connect you. And I think that's what's most important.
Do you think it's made you a better communicator politically?
Absolutely. I think that's a one big thing that's helped me. Another thing is working on I was a city council campaign manager,
Mm.
and I was stationed almost exclusively in conservative areas to try to advocate for a gay candidate against a conservative. And when people are going to go vote, they don't really want to listen to you. So you have to like really figure out how to talk to people,
Mm-hmm.
or they're going to ignore you. And I
Right.
did that for 12 hours a day for a total of 4 weeks, in early vote and then before election day. And I think that was like a boot camp on how to communicate with the other side.
Look, I think it's a skill that we need to start teaching. I mean, could you imagine being able to create a middle school course on how to foster dialogue? Do you think it's something we should start that soon? Like if you were to advocate, how do we have a better, we've none of us like the current political climate that we're living in right now, right? None of us are um based on your experience, do you think you could create a dialogue curriculum?
Um, I think Braver Angels and several organizations like that, like there's an
Mm-hmm.
organization at UVA called Common Law Grounds.
Mm.
They have a fantastic deliberative formula that leads people to leave as friends. They come as with extremely different ideologies. They often leave
Mm-hmm.
with extremely different ideologies, but they don't leave with that animus that
Yeah.
animates our politics. So I think there's a formula that researchers have found. The real struggle is finding ways to inject that into daily life so it becomes ubiquitous, right?
Right.
Always the really high effort people that want to find unity,
You can.
we can
Yeah.
find it, but
It's a
most people don't
choice.
really have very
Yeah.
much attention for politics. How can we make them not hate each other? And I think that honestly really does come down to people's social media feeds.
Yeah.
Um, as much as I hate to say it, because social media incentivizes being inflammatory. I think that's a lot of the reason why we have the problems that we do today.
I think it is too. Micah, my buzzer went off. We went over a little bit, but this was great. You seem ready. You going to run for office someday? Is that what you'd like to do, or would you like to help others run for office?
I think I've been involved with enough campaigns to not really envy politicians. I think it's a harder lifestyle, the one that I want to live. But of course, I want to be involved. I look at our country and I see a huge number of ways that we can dramatically improve people's lives, and
Mm-hmm.
anything I can do to help be a part of that solution, I'm interested in.
James Talarico, do you think he's the future, and do you think running for Senate was the right call, or did you want him to run for another office?
I asked him to run. I told him he was giving speeches before he ran, and I told him, I said, I know you're about to run. Like, I know this is the speech that you're going to use when you run, and it's absolutely true. He's using that speech right now. I think he's a fantastic candidate. To me, candidate quality comes down to several factors. One of them is being credibly anti-establishment, which I think is people don't like the establishment in our country. They don't like the status quo.
Correct.
But the second thing is for Democrats, having a candidate that can go on offense with a group that you're traditionally doing poorly with, right? Whether that be working class Hispanics, or in the case of James Talarico, Christians, making the case to Christians that actually, if you want to support, if you want to do what's godly, if you want to follow in the steps of Jesus, maybe you don't want to pursue Christian nationalism. Maybe you want to pursue a politics based in compassion. I think that's a message that needs to get out there. Somebody who's been touched by Christianity so much in my life, I think it's really fantastic that he is going to be leading our ticket, hopefully, if he wins this primary.
Micah, it's great to get to know you. And I know I'll be paying a lot more attention to what you're up to, especially when I see you develop a housing policy that might work for America.
Absolutely. Thanks.
All right.